Good morning, everyone. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President at the Middle East Institute. Welcome to today's webinar, After COVID-19, Economic Recovery in the Middle East. This is the third and final edition based on the series of papers that the Middle East Institute produced for this year's US presidential campaign. Our first two events examined challenges and opportunities in the Middle East related to political and security issues. Today's panel, as the title implies, will look at the third element of economic challenges. Needless to say, economic conditions in the Middle East are far different than we anticipated when we launched this project a year ago. Whether we're looking towards a second term for President Trump or a first term for Vice President Biden, the issues that the next US administration will confront in the region will require serious and sustained US engagement. Countries in the MENA region are facing a number of near and long-term economic challenges, including sustained low oil prices, rising unemployment, and the reallocation of government resources to combat COVID-19. We'll be looking to our panel this morning to delve into all of those issues and to map a way forward for the next administration. It's my pleasure now to introduce our distinguished panel of experts. First, Ruba Husadi is a non-resident scholar here at the Middle East Institute and managing director of OZME Consultants, which offers advisory and consulting services related to Iraq's oil and gas sector. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Shahrukh Fardost. Shahrukh is also a non-resident scholar at MEI, as well as a research professor in the Global Research Institute at the College of William and Mary. And finally, I'd like to welcome Jean-Francois Sesnek. Jean-Francois, also a non-resident scholar at MEI. Additionally, he's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. For those interested in taking a deeper dive into all of MEI's campaign briefers, the full series of papers is posted online. You can find the link to the book, Election 2020, Challenges and Opportunities for US Policy in the Middle East, on the MEI webpage, and in the chat box if you're joining us on Zoom. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask questions by emailing events@mei.edu. And also, if you're having technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the panel discussion. I'll be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into this morning's webinar. With that, we're going to begin. I've asked each of our speakers today to provide 3 to 5 minutes of opening comments, and after that, we will go into our moderated conversation. And let me begin with you, Shahrukh.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry, and it's an honor for me to have been invited to be part of this distinguished panel. I have to say that I don't have a crystal ball because I think we are talking about beyond COVID, but based on what we know, what is happening, and the various projections that have been done by international institutions such as the IMF, OECD, and World Bank, and so forth. So there is consensus that there will be a very deep recession. We are already in the midst of it in the world economy as a whole. Nearly all the economies have been affected. The global GDP is projected to decline by about between 4.5% to 5% in 2020, and then recover gradually over a 2 to 3 year period, perhaps 4.5% to 5% growth in 2021, and then going back to its trend growth very gradually, performing below that for a while. Now, this scenario is based on the assumption that there will be a vaccine and it will be produced widely and rolled out to a very substantial portion of population globally within the next 12 to 18 months. If there are delays in that and the disease, the virus is actually goes into its second and third wave and so forth, then their recovery would be much weaker. Um, the impact this time around on the global economy compared to 2008, 2009 global recession is bigger, much bigger. At that time, global economy only declined by 1% compared to 4.5%, 5% this time. And the recovery was quicker because emerging economies and developing countries were not affected as much. They had buffers, they were able to come back sooner. This time around, developing countries have been affected very badly. And there is a two-track recovery on the way because East Asia has been able to limit the damage from the virus that I'm talking about, Korea, Taiwan, China, and so forth, and they are able to recover their industrial production. And international trade, which had declined, is projected to have declined about 8 to 10% this year for the first time since the Great Depression. Such a large decline is beginning to recover as well. It's a two-track recovery. Some countries, the East Asia is coming back sooner. Europe and North America are in a deeper recession. Latin America is in deep recession. Africa has also been affected. The Middle East, of course, which is the focus of our discussion, is being affected by two shocks. One is through the oil price and international trade in general, but the oil price the effect is very, very significant because of the lack of demand, and by the COVID-19, which has affected the region very badly, particularly through two important links for the oil exporters. Of course, the oil price and the export of oil revenues have been down by 35-40% this year, and for the oil importers, although they have benefited somewhat from a lower oil price, they have been hit hard by substantial declines in tourism revenue, in workers' remittances, and international trade. And so much of North Africa, we are talking about Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and then in the Middle East region, Lebanon and Jordan have been affected very badly by also these trends. So with that, I think I can go deeper and discuss more, but I thought this would be the introductory comment I want to make at this time.
Thank you so much, Shahrokh. And with that, let me turn to Ruba. And I think perhaps to drill down a little bit more on the issue of oil prices and the future of the energy sector in the region.
Thank you, Ambassador Farsteen, and thank you, Shahrokh, for this tour d'horizon, which gave us the context of and the perspective on what we are going through at the moment. Yes, I will focus on the oil prices and oil-producing countries and try to explain why OPEC called this year unprecedented in scale and reach, and why they said we are witnessing a recession that resulted in the sharpest downturn in energy and oil demand in living memory. Now, let me start by going a little bit backwards and remind you that OPEC already was already facing challenges even before this pandemic. Beginning of 2019, producing countries were already starting to cut their output to shore up the oil prices and deal with a glut in the market as a result of the increasing shale oil production in the US. Now, by the beginning of 2020, differences started emerging between OPEC and non-OPEC, and more precisely between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And by early March, remember, just when the world was coming to grips with COVID-19, Saudi Arabia had already launched a price war against Russia by overproducing and cutting its official selling price to win over market share. So when almost the entire world went into lockdown as a result of the pandemic, the oil-producing countries were already facing a crisis, and everyone had to follow suit after the Saudis and cut their own prices to survive, while the world turned away from their oil. Now, this is the biggest fiasco in OPEC history, and it happened exactly when the world was switching off. Refineries were sitting idle, no driving, no flying, no need for gasoline, no need for jet fuel. Now, in addition to the timing, the scale of the demand destruction was not expected. It took everyone by surprise. The global economic recession as a result of lockdowns was unprecedented, as Shahrukh just said. So the producing countries in the Middle East had to fight the pandemic, which required enormous resources, while the revenues were crushed and no one was interested in taking their oil. Of course, with subtle differences among producers, between those who had a financial buffer or financial reserves and those who did not. Now, fast forward to the post-pandemic, what are the realities they need to face up to? First, peak demand will arrive sooner than they thought. Now, OPEC is already doing revisions to its projections and cutting demand growth projection in particular over the coming years. Now, they expect demand peak to hit sometime in the 2030s, so sooner than earlier projections. This has long-term impact on the oil-producing countries. Now, unlike previous crises we have witnessed, this one is different in that the low oil prices do not generate new demand as in the past. In the past, economies grew on low fuel prices, but the world has changed, due to climate policies, the push for renewable resources of energy, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be a new reality that producing countries have to deal with this time. One of the repercussions of the pandemic is that Gulf countries will have to revisit their budgets and spending habits because the oil price will not go back close to what they need to break even or cover their deficits. The IMF projects a shortfall in oil revenues for the MENA region, so the Gulf countries plus North Africa, of $221 billion this year. That's enormous. Now, for some, as I said, the situation is worse than others, depending on the size of the financial reserves, the buffer that they had. But for all of them, some old policies that were talked about for a long time are back on the agenda, like diversifying economies away from oil. Because the uncertainties are expected to stay with us for some time, longer than previous crises, there is an acute need, for new policies to address the weaknesses in the economies at all levels, and especially where expenditures are concerned. I would point to Iraq in this context because it's a point-in case, and I won't mention it because it's an extreme case. Iraq depends on oil revenues for 91% of its revenues. And at the moment, oil revenues don't cover even 50% of its essential expenditures. Last year, 2019, Iraq was making close to over $7 billion a month. Now it's making, in a good month, it's making $3 billion. So imagine what difference that makes. Now, of course, add to that, state structures are too weak to manage any financial or fiscal policies. So this dependence on oil made it the country the worst hit in the region. I have a paper coming up probably today on MEI website on Iraq and the economic reforms and the oil crisis. Now, the second point I want to make regarding the post-pandemic era is that the reduced revenues will have a negative impact on investments in renewables in the Middle East. There will be a slowdown in investment in renewable, despite the progress that was made in the last few years, especially in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, in solar, wind, nuclear, where while less revenues means less investments in renewables. This at the time when we expect that investments in renewables will accelerate around the world precisely because of the pandemic. Now, the other thing to remember here is that the logic of investing in green energy was to free crude and fuels for export and increase revenues. Now, this is no longer logical when the demand for crude and for fuel is not growing at a reasonable pace, and everyone is fighting for market share. The third point I would make in looking ahead in the post-pandemic era, watch for cohesion within OPEC and between OPEC and non-OPEC. This is going to be challenging because everyone was hit by low oil prices and everyone suffered from producing below capacity. So as a result, compliance with OPEC policies and decisions is going to be challenging. Now, this will be accentuating because we're not going to see the demand level of 2019, even if demand is expected to grow slightly in 2021, assuming there is a global economic upturn. On a positive note, I would say long-term, the Middle East will still have an edge over shale oil. One, on lower cost production, and two, on demand for heavier Middle East grades. Middle East grades are on the heavy side, are more, there's more demand for the heavy crudes compared to the US lighter grade. The last thing I want to talk about is I don't know, do I have time to talk about the US role in all this, or shall I leave it till for the discussion?
Sorry. Why don't we leave that for the discussion, Ruba?
Okay.
Okay. So let me now turn to Jean-Francois. And Jean-Francois, you mentioned in your note, particularly in one of the issues that's going to be very much front and center is as we look at the recovery, as we look at the role of the United States in the region, is the China angle. And of course, an awful lot of the things that Ruba was talking about in terms of a recovery of oil and gas production and demand is going to be contingent on how quickly the Chinese economy recovers. And that also has implications in terms of the role of the United States going forward. So let me turn to you, and if you would like to comment on that, we would be delighted.
Very good, and I must say, Shahrukh and Ruba have covered a lot of the points I was going to make before I talked about China, so I will skip that. But I think it's very important to mention what's happening today in the Gulf, in the relationship between the Gulf and China. Today, China is still the largest buyer of oil from the Gulf by far. And it is also buying natural gas, mostly from Qatar, of course. And besides that, it's also buying an enormous amount of chemicals and petrochemicals and fertilizers and whatnot from the Gulf. So I think the power of China is really increasing very rapidly in the region. The role of China is becoming very important for the UAE and for Saudi Arabia in particular. I would say that what we could look for is a major effort by China to become and continue to be and increase its dominance of trade between the Gulf and China itself. That is actually bringing a point which hasn't been too much covered in the press lately anyway, is the importance of the renminbi in the trade. I believe that one of the big weakness of China in dealing with the world in general, but also with the Gulf in particular, is the fact that all its trade is in US dollars. And that gives the United States an enormous amount of power in controlling whom they can have sanctions against and who can freely deal with dollars, especially in Iran and so on. I would imagine that China, and what I seem to be reading from the statements of some of the Chinese officials, is that China will try to increasingly make the renminbi international and freely convertible. If that's the case, a lot of the trade, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade between China and the Gulf, would slowly but fairly rapidly actually be moved to renminbi, which will make the life of the United States very difficult. So I think we should keep an eye on that very much. There's a couple of smaller points I wanted to mention, which have not totally been mentioned by Ruba and Shahrukh, is the fact that the Gulf will have to cope with the decline in prices. No doubt that the decline in demand of 30% on the demand of oil is going to keep the prices in the $40 to $50 a barrel, even if production of US shale declines. I totally agree that the demand is not going to pick up enormously, but the enormous deficits that are being created by this shortfall is really forcing the countries to make decisions or to take decisions which they have not been willing to do in the past. The fact that the Saudis increased their value-added tax to 15% in July is really something which nobody wanted to do. But on the other hand, it sort of is a first step to having the economies become less dependent on oil. The increase in VAT income for 2021 is expected to be in the $30 billion, in the range of $30 billion, which is not quite the deficit which is creating by the low oil prices, but it's really almost half of it. And it's forcing the country to really focus on not doing oil. So I think it also forces the countries to sort of realize that the oil will not be so much needed in the future and to focus on new technologies. One of the interesting developments in Saudi Arabia lately has been that the kingdom has signed a big contract with a US company to start developing green hydrogen and green ammonia and the largest plants in the world in Saudi Arabia. So that would give technology and to Saudi Arabia and give it the ability to slowly, but not that slowly, really replace oil as its main source of income. So if the Saudis and the Gulfies in general, and the UAE in particular, can start controlling the technology in renewables as much as they are controlling the technology and the use of oil worldwide, I think they managed to get out of all this, but it's going to be very tricky and it's going to take time. The final point is on the remittances. I just read this morning that the remittances to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines was close to about $90 billion a year pre-COVID. Now, with COVID, of course, we're maybe down to 60 billion or so, but those are enormous amounts of money. And if the deficit, as Ruba mentioned, of all the countries of MENA is going to be over $200 billion, they're going to have to make an enormous effort to not depend on foreign workers and make sure that the remittances decline rapidly. This is not going to be easy, and it's going to be very painful for the Philippines and Kerala and places like this. But that is something we can discuss further. So maybe I'll stop right here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Francois. And I wanted to follow up on that point and maybe turn to Shahrukh first, because we've talked an awful lot about the Gulf states, about the oil exporting and gas exporting states in the region. and the impact on them. You touched on some of the other implications for Egypt, for Tunisia, for Jordan, Lebanon as well. But to come back to that a little bit and to make a couple of points. One is the point that Jean-Francois just made, which is the impact of the decline of remittances, the number of guest workers who are leaving the Gulf right now because their jobs have been terminated or because they have their own concerns about health, that we have hundreds of thousands of skilled labor and even middle management leaving the region right now. And that means that there are going to be implications. And it's not only for the Philippines or India, it's also for Egypt, it's for Jordan, it's for Lebanon, Tunisia. So they are going to be confronted with a decline in remittances. They're being hit very hard in terms of their own ability to generate hard currencies, the decline of tourism, the decline in their own export industries that are not energy related, and the ability of the Gulf states to write checks to help stabilize that have been so important over these past years, again, in stabilizing the Egyptian economy and stabilizing the Jordanian economy. That also is going to decline as those states are forced to focus more heavily on stabilizing their own economies and their own economic situations. And so the question is, and I'm bringing this back to the role of the U.S., what are the expectations, what are the requirements for the international community, particularly the United States, in helping to stabilize these economies and get them to avoid collapse, which would have obviously political insecurity and extremism implications for the future.
Who should go?
Please, Shahrukh.
Okay. Well, I think in order to answer your question, I need to make one important point that this shock that has hit the world and the region has, I think, has had a damaging effect on the long-term prospects, economic prospects, welfare prospects for the region globally, but also for the region. And that is because given the significant amount of excess capacity worldwide in both manufacturing and in construction, because of the tourism and business travel and all that, there is going to be a significantly lower rate of investment going forward in all countries, including in the region. And this will have an impact on productivity and the trend growth, GDP growth of these countries going forward. So there is a long-term damage that is done. I think is going to be very difficult to recoup this damage over a medium term. It's a long-term damage. The second thing that is also related to this and related to your question is that this time, this shock has hit the services sector and the informal economies of these countries very hard, which is usually the informal economy and services were like a buffer, prevented the recessions to become too deep. But this time, because of the nature of this virus, it has had a very negative effect. And that has really had a big effect on poverty rates and unemployment and so forth. So I think two things have happened. One is the damage has been deep and very serious to the social order. Unemployment rates are high, poverty rates have increased, and middle classes have come under tremendous strain. Countries have been able to meet this challenge through fiscal and monetary policies, but they're running out of bullets, because if this recession is prolonged more than a year from now, then there will be a huge have to be a huge cutback, because these countries, none of them are able to, except for the richest GCC members, are able to resort to their official reserves and to borrow. Debt levels are already very high, and based on a very quick look at the numbers, oil exporters have lost close to $200 billion in reserves between from the end of 2018 to what is expected at the end of 2020. That's $200 billion on top of another $150 billion cutback on imports. So in order to be able, I'm just talking about the oil exporters even. So now, given the violence, the crisis, the political social crisis in the Middle East, and given the regional and global public goods issues such as the environment, the refugees, the shortage of water, and so forth, I think the region must rely on itself in order to solve its problems. But it needs a helping hand to do this. And of course, US has been, as you know, Jerry, traditionally a trusted uh, outside power that has been able to come in and bring the groups both outside the Middle East and inside the Middle East together. It has done it several times, not lately, but it has done it before. And I think this is one thing that maybe the region itself is ready for it, but it has to be kind of pressured or cajoled to start discussing, because many of these issues can be actually solved internally within the region by reducing conflict, reducing the military expenditure, and shifting the allocating these resources to social development, fighting poverty, infrastructure, and so forth. And the region could become much more of a shock absorber if it is more integrated. So it doesn't depend so much on the outside. It could depend more on itself. So there are ways to go forward there, and I'm hopeful that maybe we are at the critical juncture now that something like this could happen.
Great, thank you, Shahrukh. Aruba, let me turn to you, and you had started to talk a little bit about the U.S. role, the U.S. angle at the end of your presentation. Let me put a couple of thoughts on the table in terms of what we can anticipate if there is a Biden victory tomorrow, or conversely, if there is a Trump victory tomorrow. On the one hand, if there is a Biden administration beginning in January, he is on the record as saying that that climate change will be a priority issue for him, that he is committed to certainly reducing U.S. carbon footprint over the coming years, and wants the U.S. to be completely carbon neutral by 2050, I think is the time frame that he's put on. He has indicated that he would be opposed to continuing subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, and presumably would be more inclined to provide a helping hand for investment in renewables. So those are all issues that will have an impact not only on U.S. domestic oil production, but also, of course, on U.S. demand for imported oil and gas. Conversely, if there's a Trump administration, we can anticipate that he will continue the prioritization that he's made up until now of U.S. domestic production, and of course the idea, fallacious but nevertheless the idea, that the U.S. is somehow energy independent, is a main pillar of Donald Trump's overall, kind of economic policy. And so one can anticipate that if there is a continuation of Trump administration, we could see continued demand in the United States for carbon-based energy. But on the other hand, he would also want to emphasize U.S. domestic production. And so looking at those two kind of conflicting directions that the two candidates would take, how do you see this affecting the Gulf and other? We should point out that, of course, one of the major developments that's happening right now is the development also of Eastern Mediterranean energy resources as well. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the Gulf isn't the only player in the energy market in the region anymore. So, Ruba?
Yeah. I would tackle this from a foreign policy point of view. I mean, on one hand, there is the domestic impact of any change in the administration on, as you said, the production of energy and on the consumption. But I would say the question on the U.S. role is, is there going to be a possible return to engagement with the region versus the withdrawal under Trump? The OPEC plus agreements were spearheaded by agreements between Putin and MBS. Now, this is an important element in the dynamics of the region that has to be taken into consideration. So what role does the US see for itself in this context, other than reacting to low oil prices or to high oil prices, depending on who's suffering more, the US oil industry or the consumer at the pump, as we have seen under Trump? The second thing I would say, the region needs, and here, as you said, not only the Gulf, but also the East Med, also North Africa. These regions need peace and security, which requires some kind of multilateralism versus Trump's alliances on transactional basis. The US foreign policy under Trump had two axes, Saudi Arabia and Israel, while other regional powers were sort of marginalized to different extents. Now, to achieve or help achieve the peace and security, which itself will lead to prosperity, now this requires engagement at several levels and in several directions beyond transactions-based foreign policy. The third point, I would say, a change in the administration would have an impact on the relationship with Iran. Where does Iran fit into all of this? A possible détente with Iran and Venezuela in this context, could see more oil hitting the market. Now, this could be a problem for the regional producers, outside of Iran, but it could be mitigated with how quickly is China's recovery going to be, as Jean-François has said. So I think the US foreign policy has to take all of these into consideration, and maybe I expect we could see a change. If there's a change in administration, we have to look at those three different axes of foreign policy.
Thank you, Ruba. Jean-François, we have a couple of questions from the audience regarding investment in renewables in the region. I think it was Ruba who made the comment that because of the downturn in budgets in the Gulf, that there's been a slowdown in investment in renewables. But you mentioned some of the new technologies that are being developed, the green ammonia technology. Where exactly? Because as has been pointed out, one of the driving issues in Gulf renewable development was this idea that they would turn to renewables for their own domestic requirements in order to leave available for export the oil and gas, their main export earners. If that's no longer the case, is there still an appetite for development of renewables, and also to understand there's kind of an interesting dynamic, and of course a lot of discussion over the course of these past months is that because of the impact of COVID and the downturn in the global economies, there's been a reduction in oil and gas consumption. And yet in some other areas, particularly in plastics, because all of us who are going and using takeout restaurant opportunities are getting lots and lots of single-use plastic containers. And globally, there's an increase. And so while the consumption for transportation and manufacturing and other areas of oil and gas consumption is down, plastics perhaps is up, and maybe for the Saudis, for SABIC, or for some others, the cloud is not quite as dark as it might have appeared earlier on. So where exactly are we on this transition to more sustainable, greener economies?
Well, I don't know where we are exactly. I wish I could. I wish I knew that answer. But the fact is, and you're absolutely true, I think the demand for raw energy, for the raw carbon molecules from petroleum and natural gas, that has been mentioned by my fellow panelists here, is really going to decline perhaps faster than anyone thinks. On the other hand, the downstream is increasing tremendously. The demand for plastics, the demand for advanced technologies in chemicals is really moving forward. And companies like SABIC, like Borouge in the UAE, and many other companies is really moving forward and increasing the demand. So yes, there is a definite as has been mentioned, there is a definite problem in finding the money to invest in renewables, but the money will have to come somehow and to develop those technologies. The downstream from oil will continue. There'll be less production of the main oil of crude and gas, but there will be more developments in advanced, especially advanced chemicals. There's not much money in basic chemicals, but in advanced chemicals, there's a lot of growth possible for the Gulf. I think so. There's a lot of plus and a lot of minuses here. I mean, definitely one thing that is we see is some great developments in Saudi Arabia on this green hydrogen and green ammonia that we mentioned. A lot of it is public relations, however. In order to do this green hydrogen project, they need 4 gigawatts of electricity from solar. And that is not going to happen anytime soon unless there's some kind of a miracle. We even see some backwards progress. In Dubai, they're now starting a big coal plant to make electricity based on coal. So we're not quite sure where all this is going, but the value added to the carbon molecules is the future of the Gulf. And that will continue to happen. And they can also do the same type of things with the renewables. But there has to be a lot of political direction on this. So we'll see how that goes.
Thank you. So Shahrukh, we have a question for you from M. Kavusi, who says, "It's commendable how skillfully all of the speakers dance around the big lion, Iran, in their discussions." Now, Ruba, of course, touched a little bit on it, but Monsieur Kavusi, or Madame Kavusi, believes that you know the answer to this question. And so let me put it to you, Shahrukh. What about Iran?
Well, I think Iran has been hit probably the hardest than any other oil exporting countries in the Middle East. Outside of Middle East, of course, Venezuela has been hit very hard with a combination of I mean, lower oil prices than the U.S. sanctions, which have been much more intense than even during the Obama administration, which led to the JCPOA agreement. And then the COVID, which has been very destructive in Iran because it has affected the informal sector, it has affected the services, affected the economy, and it has put tremendous pressure on the health system, which had already been weakened because of the years of sanctions. So I think not I'm not exaggerating if I say that Iran's per capita income may have declined by between 14 to 15% in the last 2.5 years since the Trump administration imposed these sanctions. Now, not all of that decline is because of the sanctions, obviously, but a combination with COVID and also maybe some of the policies that were in place were not appropriate. Iran's reserves, official reserves, which had been hovering around $100 billion, are now down to between 10 to $20 billion. It's not very clear what the exact estimate is. Even if it's higher than that, it may not have immediate access to it because of the financial restrictions, the dollar, the role of the dollar, and then the secondary sanctions, which have affected also Iran's non-oil exports. So I think the situation in Iran is very, very difficult for both the government and, of course, even more so for people of Iran. Unemployment is high, poverty has been rising, the standard of living has been affected, and so forth. So I'm sure that in Iran, many people are hoping for a change in policies and in their circumstances. Now, how that change is going to come about, maybe one possibility is through some change of posture by the U.S. Towards Iran, and that could be reciprocated. But I don't have a crystal ball.
Thank you, Shahrokh. Ruben, your note, you say that fighting the pandemic while revenues are crushed and no one is taking their oil, a reality check on structural reforms needed to avoid the next crisis. We have a question from Eric Hahn asking if you could comment on how a few governments in the region are enforcing compliance with the COVID restrictions and how they're balancing economic and public health priorities, which would go, I think, to some of the structural issues that that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, there are differences in the region between countries. Some of them have managed that better than others. For example, let me say the UAE has been able to, well, first they have very reduced number of cases and fatalities compared to the population size, and they were able to limit the lockdown to, I think we had something like weeks compared to months, for example, in Saudi Arabia. And they were able to restart their economies and even open to tourists, full swing opening the country to tourists much earlier than others. And that's because there are of course differences between Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi is able to rely on the financial cushion I was talking about and the financial reserves and so on. Dubai less so they had to it's an economy that's dependent on services, on tourism, so they had to push it a bit earlier. But it was well managed. Now compare this to the other extreme. I would say it's Iraq. Iraq has very badly managed this. It's well, first the public health sector was already dilapidated for many years. Was dilapidated since before 2003 because of the sanctions, and continued. It was never rehabilitated after 2003. So when the pandemic hit, there was nothing they could do. So Iraq is the example of a country which decided to go with the herd immunity. You know, there's nothing they could do to fight the spread of the pandemic, and they don't have the abilities to deal with the sick people. So and on top of that, add to that they do not have the financial resources. They don't know, the oil revenues are barely paying salaries and pensions. Nothing else. Food, a little bit electricity, and that's it. So there you have the differences between I would put Saudi Arabia in the middle, because Saudi Arabia, the extent of the pandemic has been a lot, you know, I mean, it was the biggest in the region, but that goes in line with the population size and so on. And it was, you know, reasonably managed financially, because Saudi Arabia did not have that problem similar to the UAE, but they could not control it on the ground for various reasons that have to do with the, you know, again, state institutions and structures, and how do you go on controlling a pandemic of this scale.
Thanks, Ruba. Jean-Francois, we talked a little bit about China and how the Chinese factor plays into the way forward on the Gulf particularly, but also more broadly in the region. You have noted also that beyond China, one of the, if you can say winners, I don't know that anyone is a winner in this, but one of the regions that comes out marginally ahead on all of this is East Asia. Not only the Chinese, but also Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Could you comment a little bit about what the implications are in terms of, presumably they have lower oil prices as a result of the current situation, and are able to maintain their export markets and even expand. So if you would talk a little bit about the rest of Asia, and also one other factor, you know, since we want to think through a little bit about the implications for the U.S. or where the U.S. might go. Certainly, a Biden administration might be inclined to try to revive the TPP, and what are the implications of that in terms of the Middle East and U.S. and broader Asian engagement in the region?
Yes, absolutely. Definitely among the winners, as you say, if we can talk about winners, definitely Japan and Korea are very high on the list, because I think the credibility of the United States in the Gulf has taken an enormous hit under the Trump administration. The fact that we have been unable to manage the COVID-19 is really terrible for our prestige over there. And next to that, you got China is now basically opened and increasing its activity. They're having parties all night, apparently, according to the news. And Japan and Korea are also doing extremely well. So I certainly think that Japan, Korea will be, in a way, proxies and replace the United States a little bit in the Gulf in terms of the influence of non-Chinese influence in the Gulf. So the one side issue, but a very important issue, is the role of the US Navy in all this, because the United States to this day is providing freedom of navigation. And even China, and an increasing power, does not have the ability to provide freedom of navigation, even though China benefits from it a great deal, but also so does Japan and Korea. So by providing this freedom of navigation, we're sort of helping our proxies, if you like, in a way, in the Gulf. Whether or not the US will join back or manage to renegotiate the TPP with the Southeast Asian countries, which is really an agreement against China, we'll see. It may be of some importance, and I think it is indeed, I think, a very vital key to a future or a regaining of credibility by the United States. If that's the case, if the TPP is redeveloped, then the Gulf will really give more credibility to the US, even though they will not cut off their nose to spite their face, and they will still deal very closely with China for sure.
Excellent. Well, we have about 4 minutes left in our hour, and so I wanted to give everyone an opportunity just to make any closing points. What advice you would give to the incoming administration in January, either a renewal of the Trump administration or a new Biden administration. So let's go in reverse order and begin with you, Jean-Francois.
Ooh. I guess advice is very cheap. You know, it's quite easy to give good advice, and even if nobody ever listens to it, and I hope they don't listen to it, because then, of course, I would be wrong if they did. So, but in any case, I think from the United States standpoint, I think we should still put some emphasis on providing the freedom of navigation, which I just mentioned. I think that will continue to happen. We may want to continue what we have started now, is basically this alliance of the Gulf against Iran, because under Biden, the main enemy of the United States will continue to be Iran, and that will not change. So by creating these alliances between Israel and the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and perhaps Saudi Arabia, it's really against Iran, and put the pressure on Iran. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I think that's probably what, by creating a unity within the Gulf, by pushing the Gulf states, the GCC states, to become more united under basically a US defense arrangement, it may push the Iranians to go forward. I would certainly like to see that the JCPOA get revived, but I'm not sure it's going to happen. I think there's so much pressure from within the Gulf and Israel against the JCPOA that it's not going to happen. But your point, which I think is really excellent, and I hadn't thought of until you just mentioned, is the TPP revival. And I think indeed that will be the way to sort of combat, or compete rather than combat, compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think will be very important for the near future.
Thank you, Jean-Francois. And my advice is always free. So, Ruba?
Well, very briefly, I would say I would take the opposite point of view than Jean-Francois. I don't think antagonizing Iran further is going to be beneficial for anyone, not for the region and not for the US either, or the West in general. And on the contrary, it will lead to more instability. And I find this polarization that happened since the US pulled out of the JCPOA has not been good for anyone. We haven't seen anyone flourish just because the US withdrew from that. Looking forward, I don't think it can be revived in its form as it is. I think we need to look for a new sort of accommodation that would bring more stability rather than antagonism in the region. And the last thing I would say, the US engagement in the region has to be on other terms than just military.
Thanks. And certainly I would anticipate that regardless of who wins tomorrow, the U.S. military role in the region is going to go down. Not necessarily, that doesn't mean the engagement is going to go down. It doesn't mean that the interest is going to go down, but I would anticipate that the level of military engagement is going to be reduced. Shahrukh, you had the first word. Now you have the last word.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think I would expect two things from the new administration. One is to protect and strengthen multilateralism. Don't put a wrecking ball to a system that has served the world economy and political institutions well for the past 70, 80 years. So, and in that context, work with its allies, other interested parties to bring peace and tranquility in this region that has been almost destroyed, because of the, many years of conflict and the civil war and so forth, and the continuation of antagonism between the U.S. and Iran. Of course, it has to be settled between the two of them, the two countries, given their own medium-term, long-term interests. But Iran is a very large country of 82, 83 million people, and instability in Iran is basically instability for the entire Middle East. So it doesn't serve anyone's purpose to cause further conflict in the region. I think there are, even if the Trump administration is re-elected in the office, I think they need to look at the strategy they have vis-a-vis Iran and come to some kind of a more realistic long-term vision that serves the region, their allies, and the US well. And that scenario is not based on conflict.
Thank you, Shahrukh. And that brings us to the end of our discussion today. I want to again thank our three panelists, Shahrukh Fardost, Ruba Husari, and Jean-Francois Sesnek, for an excellent discussion, presentation, and a look ahead, I think, to what we might anticipate is going to be a U.S. engagement, involvement in a very trying period for not only the region, but the entire world over these next several years. And I would also like to thank, of course, all of you for joining us for this conversation. And we look forward to meeting you again virtually very soon. So thank you very much, and have a nice day, and vote.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice to see you all.